Hello again. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to add the GrowUp data to NewGene. And in the process, this is going to allow me to explain the difference between a float variable and an integer variable and how that can make a difference when one is trying to input data into NewGene. So to begin, the GrowUp data is data that is used to analyze various forms of intrastate conflict. So specifically, GrowUp stands for Geographical Research on War Unified Platform. And as the word unified platform suggests, it is pulling together a variety of different data on ethnic groups, government policies, intrastate conflict. And so these data in many ways can complement the data that come from PRIO and the correlates of war that are already preloaded into NewGene. Now the GrowUp data itself is not preloaded into NewGene, but it is possible to include those data in NewGene. Now to do so, the first step would be to actually download the GrowUp data itself. And that can be done by, of course, going to the GrowUp website, clicking on the download tab, and then selecting the data that one would wish to use, either at the group level or the country level. What's important to notice is that whether one chooses group level data or country level data, the data itself will have a country year format, where you can see that there's a country code, there's the country name, and there's the year. This is going to be important when we actually try to input this data into NewGene. Once we've selected the variables, of course, using GrowUp, you can then log in, register, it's free to do so, and then you can download the data in the CSV format. And I've already done that, and that resulted in the following spreadsheet. Now, as you can see, this spreadsheet has the first row reports the actual variable names. In particular, you can see that there's a country code. Now, I actually renamed the country indicator as C code so that it would be consistent with the other data that are already found in NewGene. You can also see that there's the year variable. The next row, and this is related to something that I explained in the video on actually inputting data into NewGene. So you can see I have a row that indicates the type of variable, whether the variable is an integer or a string in this case, where a string would be, for example, the name United States, whereas an integer is the country code, hence a 2, an actual digit. Having formatted or at least downloaded these data, I'm now ready to go to NewGene and include the data. So I'm going to minimize this spreadsheet, minimize this table, and then I'm going to open NewGene. Now, since I'm incorporating the data, I'm going to go to the Input Dataset tab. And then in this case, I don't need to create a new DMU. I also do not need to manage the units of analysis because, as I already showed, GrowUp uses a country year unit of analysis. And as you can see, that's already available in NewGene. So I'm going to go to the Manage Variable Groups tab. I'm going to then select Add a New Variable Group. I'm going to call this new variable group GrowUp. And I'm going to, for the short description, just all caps GrowUp. Now, I'm going to select my unit of analysis. As I mentioned, it is going to be the country year. So I'm going to select country year. Then I can click OK. So, as you can see, NewGene has told me that the variable group GrowUp has been successfully created and asked me if I would like to import data for GrowUp now. And I would. So I'm going to click yes. And as I showed in a previous video, we can import the data by going and clicking on Browse. And then I've actually saved these data on my desktop, and here it is, GrowUp. So I'm going to double click. It's now included. It's now been placed into the box here, along with the file path. Now, if you remember when I brought up the spreadsheet itself, the country code was actually called C code. So I'm going to type that in. That was the name of the variable. And then it was using a year indicator. I'm going to put that in for the start year. Now, since this is country year data, it doesn't have an end year indicator, so we're going to leave that blank. And then the final thing we're going to do is we're going to click on the data file includes an additional row with column data types. We're going to mark that because indeed it does include that row. Now the next thing is, now that we've clicked that, we're ready to import it, but I want you to pay attention to what's going to happen once I click OK. Okay, it's asked me, you have opted to leave the ending year column blank. That is correct. I'm going to click yes. As you can see, NewGene has generated an error. Number of rows of data failed to read from import file, 8,752. So 8,752 rows have failed to read. Now that number is significant because if I pull back up the spreadsheet, if I scroll all the way down, you can see right here that there's 8,754 rows. But remember that the first two rows are the variable name and the variable type. So that means there's 8,752 rows of actual data. That's the same as the number of rows that NewGene failed to import. What that means is that NewGene failed to import any of these data. So the question is why? What happened? Well, what happened, and in another video I'll show how to identify this happened, but specifically what happened was some of the variables I indicated that they were an integer, when in reality they are actually a float variable. And specifically, that is all the variables that have decimal points. This should actually not be an integer, this should be a float. Same thing with this one. In fact, each one of these. Now I have another spreadsheet where I already went through and corrected these. So I'm going to use the corrected row, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just paste that here. So as you can see, I've now pasted, and so whereas these are integers, all of them with a decimal point are indicated as being a float. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and we're going to try saving this under a different name. So we're going to save as, and we're going to try saving this again to the desktop. And we're going to save this as GrowUp, and we'll just try new. Save. That is fine. Now we'll go ahead and minimize this. And what we'll do is, since it did not work, we'll go here, we'll click on our variable group again. We'll go to refresh selected variable group file. It'll give me this warning about it'll be much faster. Delete the existing. Would you like to continue? Yes, we will. What we will do is we will now go down and we're going to use the GrowUp new. C code, year, data file, and so everything else is the same, but now we're using the one that has the variables that should be indicated as floats are actually indicated as floats. We click OK. It'll again give me the warning about the end year being blank. We'll say OK. And as you can see, the progress bar we are actually importing. So making that correction has now enabled NewGene to actually start inputting these data. So we'll wait a moment for it to complete, and then at that point we'll be able to go back to the Output Data Set tab and actually see where it has included these new variables. All right, so it took about a minute for NewGene to add in those variables. There are quite a few variables in the GrowUp dataset, so hence that's why it took a while. You can see here the variable group GrowUp, country year, successfully read 8,052 rows. So that is now what we wanted to see. Recall again that before the error said that it failed to read these rows, we have now incorporated these rows. So we will click OK. And then what we can do is go back to the output data set, and you can see that now the GrowUp data are available. And they are now available for us to be able to incorporate these data with some of the other data that are already preloaded into NewGene. Thank you.